bit later. I'm still on recording duty.
Gotcha. It's much appreciated. Man. Okay. All right. Is that up for everyone? Figma. Going cool. All right.
Yeah, I see it.
All right. So I thought it'd be best to start. Thanks everyone for coming. But given the topics we talk about and the intensity of this topic for quite a few people, I wanted to clarify what this is not. One, it's not high level in the sense of, for example, last week, Gabriel gave a really interesting presentation on the relationship between environment and social and math and science. And I'm going to just kind of use those terms loosely and without that level of rigor. I'm hoping to present more at that kind of, what I'll call loosely second order down the road, but I do kind of want to try to focus on the nuts and bolts of like applying our organizational analysis to this as a current problem. Secondly, it's definitely not, besides very like, probably not particularly like sophisticated usage of gender and queer theory. This is not a presentation that's going to go deeply into that. This is very much kind of starting out of a research project that is prioritizing organizational political actions. And so I definitely want references and things like that to anything, but this is all very provisional and like just starting out. And it's not that, because in a sense what it is, and this is the third part, is it is kind of an attempt to ask the old Marxy questions from the early 20th century of the relationship between inter-imperialist crisis, rising fascism, and how like practically do we defend what we do have in the face of that. And so this was kind of asking old questions from the perspective of the current right-wing assault on trans rights, queer people more generally, and then intersectionally multiple others, from that kind of perspective. But obviously you can't get into that question without all these other levels. So I am trying to focus on certain things, but especially in discussion, I do want to hear of any references, thoughts, critiques on how I'm utilizing any of these materials, etc. So yeah, so I'm actually going to begin from within that kind of like Marxy perspective, which is the United States has, launched a war it couldn't keep up with 20 years ago. And that destabilized the entire region, sent the world economy plunging, allowed geopolitical rivals to get unprecedented levels of influence, and set multiple domestic schisms into play within the United States. And this here is a very crude and institution kind of based periodicity. Another disclaimer, this is going to be very like within the United States. I apologize for that, but that is the context I'm thinking organizationally, because that's where I'm at. And within the United States, because of our really effective undemocratic democracy, you can plot a lot of periods by presidents. So, when I was a kid coming up, we kind of had these two left circles over here, which was really like the right wing that we've seen kind of go into crisis and schism in multiple ways, as well as more explicitly it looked like, actual fascist white supremacists since Trump. The backdrop of that, of what was considered normal conservatism, is Reagan conservatism, which itself wasn't normal when it came about compared to the earlier. But by the time we get to 2015 and forward, that is the kind of contextual backdrop that determines what is you get to the point where you have fucking Democrats talking about the good old Bush years, because that is what is supposed to have been normal. And when you have Clinton win in 92, that moral majority logic then goes into opposition with Newt Gingrich, but you still have this basic kind of like effective capacity for the Republican Party to tie together a large number of overwhelmingly white, but not only importantly, but overwhelmingly white Americans into a consensus that starts to go in crisis with the fall of the Soviet Union, but that crisis doesn't really hit. And below that, what we see in terms of right-wing extremism remains, while it's very fucking intense when it does blow up, very much dispersed and not massive, right? You have Ruby Ridge, you have Waco, you have the Oklahoma City bombing, all of which were, from within kind of American experience, intense moments of domestic violence, but they very much existed as one-off. A single organization would kind of get consumed in any one of these kind of moments. This began to change radically with the Bush years and the launch of the global war on terror after 9/11, in large part because as policy, the Bush administration did actually come down fairly hard on a number of right-wing groups. And on the other hand, a lot of potential right-wing recruits were able to find satisfaction in their more depraved tendencies by actually joining the U.S. military and going and committing war crimes in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so during the Bush years, and I'd say a substantial portion of the Obama years, the war itself was a place where a lot of what are now like extant right-wing extremists were putting their energy. Then with Obama, you have on the one hand the normalization of the global war on terror. You begin to see a lot of the quote unquote blowback in terms of the first moves of Russia and the Ukraine, Syria, and a lot of the current conflagrations across northern and north central Africa, like start to take off in the Obama years. And against that, you begin to see like a right-wing populist movement in the form of the Tea Party take off. And that's really when you see the first wave of the current like assault build, not so much on trans folks, obviously, at that point, but in terms of a transition from an earlier stage that had been dominant for decades, where the politics of the right could be more or less containerized by the Republicans, to the first real populist offshoot that, while it would be more or less successfully like containerized itself, was the cracking point that then led to more and more waves of increasingly extremist populist right-wing movements. Of course, like a turning point for that was the 2015 launch of the Trump campaign and his equation of all Latinx immigrants as criminals and worse. And that became insofar as the right has events, that became like a bit of an event and a coordinating point around which a lot of the right wing began to launch itself. There was the Unite the Right rally, which largely was politically a failure. You had multiple attempts to organize explicit white supremacy that really did not catch on at the level that a lot of folks like right-winger Richard Spencer thought they would. And eventually they actually hit a kind of limit that played out on a lot of levels, but especially came in 2020 with the mass Black Lives Matter protests. Trump using the Border Patrol to try to intimidate protesters, and all the right-wingers attempting to mobilize around that, as well as anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown, and largely losing momentum after the 2020 election, as well as multiple local defeats by counter-protesters. So that very quick and crude periodicity is by way of presenting a problem for the right wing. That despite unprecedented access to being outright shameless, racist, sexist, etc., despite rising incidences of right-wing violent terror since Trump's campaign, and since very real attempts to organize mass far-right movements, those all failed despite having a more or less explicit white nationalist in office. So that's a pretty big political defeat from the perspective of those who were trying to pull things to the right. And this is part of the value of something like Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, while all these things obviously like overlap and intensify at points that have of folks who do have multiple oppressions, one of the places where that becomes the most intense and also most fractious are around trans folks. And the far right in the United States has found remarkable results, both at the level of right-wing extremists, Proud Boys style recruiting on the ground, as well as the increasing fascistic tendencies of the GOP itself. The first presidential debate, basically everyone came out explicitly trying to ban gender affirming care. And that's a complete development of a position that, while there was certainly no pro-trans and there was plenty of anti-trans rhetoric 4 years ago, it's become an actual program of the right, from the highest levels of party politics down to the street fighting fascist gang level behavior. So this is the kind of problem that the United States presents itself, or leftists in the United States are presented with at the moment. And the way I've been asking the question, because there are tons of great analyses out there, I'm not really contributing much in the way of, like I said, a lot of gender theory, feminist theory, as well as really interesting anti-colonial, anti-racist, indigenous, Black, Latinx intersections of all these questions. So there's a lot out there, which I'm still familiarizing myself with. What I have attempted to ask the question specifically about is the question of how this relates to the overall project of post-Trump nationalism for the right. And so I kind of went back to asking, like, what's the political question at stake for so much of the old questions about imperialism and fascism in the early 20th century? And the way I think you can ask that question is essentially, why did, it was the question that everyone was asking at the time, right? Which is, why did the Second International fail to hold together in the face of these various declarations of war by their respective countries? And the question of how nationalism could be such a powerful, identifying, affective thing that people would slaughter their respective like class comrades in that war, posed the political problem for all the theorizing that would come after 1914. And I think that that's the kind of problem that is at stake in the attack on trans rights, and why so many liberal solutions can't really address the right. Because the thesis I'm going to present is, using our theories in conjunction with several other sources, I think we can say that nationalism, as we understand in the United States, and this is what both Trumpist style nationalism and the liberal nationalism of Obama, Clinton, Biden, and others, rely upon an overall structure of organizing the world that is, first off, following Winter's work, dependent upon the international color line as a kind of metaphysical differentiator in order to maintain what being human is. And secondly, that in order to maintain that overall paradigm that she delineates so well in Unsettling, you have to have a kind of notion of sex and gender, such that the very existence of trans people undermines the entire model of what she calls man two, which is the biocentric model, which I'll get into in a second. So in a sense, from a right-wing perspective, it's a fairly simple thing. And I couldn't remember where the diagram stash was, so I just lifted this off of your presentation last week, Gabrielle. So the red circle does not, it kind of means something, I guess, here, but that's not the emphasis. But we have this idea, which I think is really simple and compelling in its simplicity, that like we can kind of develop this intuition of like the left and right as kind of opposite directions in terms of this diagram, insofar as the left, when it's asking the question of whether or not an organization is doing its job and whether or not a political movement is actually like a radical movement, the question is, does the world become a bigger place? Does it become a place with more, and there's a lot of ways to qualify that moreness, but do we expand the kind of potentiality of human organization and life through our social mediations and political actions? It's very, and moreover, how do we conceive of the individual, as it were, kind of growing within and as part of this larger world? The critical reversal that, you know, of the right is precisely to then try to reduce the world down to a particular ideal model of an individual. And this is what Winter really highlights in the notion of man as opposed to human with a small h, that you get a very, very particular notion of the individual that is universalized, and everything is shrunk down to fit that model, that figure. And so from the right-wing perspective, the question does become simply the same essential question, just reversed. In other words, does an organization actually effectively make the world a smaller place? And can a political movement effectively break enough difference in order to, again, make the world a smaller place? And so the basic idea, I think, to present here in terms of like a simple hypothesis is that the reason there is an attack on trans rights is that it's a pivotal place to shrink the world from the perspective of the right. And in shrinking the world, you're capable of maintaining a certain kind of partitioning along these borders that we call national borders. And so what's at stake is a size of a world, and as we'll see, what kind of logics you can bring to bear in that world. And a lot of, I think, the implications of our STP work is when we think about bigger and smaller, we don't necessarily have to quantify it in ways that can inadvertently, like if you talk about like more choice, you suddenly get into questions that sound a lot like liberal notions of freedom. But when we're talking about increasing a world in terms of the logics by which we can kind of solve problems and express ourselves, we're really talking about expanding worlds almost in terms of the tools we have available to create new potentialities. Therefore, what becomes important is to constrain those potentialities from the perspective of the right. I can move around here. Oh, no, it's over here. All right. So, no, it's not. I'm sorry. I lost. There it is. Okay. So this is a table from the first part of Crenshaw's essay on intersectionality, which was one of those like STP brain moments, because I was reading this and maybe unfairly applied the three logics to it, but I think there's something here. So in the first part of her famous essay on intersectionality, Crenshaw analyzes three different legal cases in which Black women were denied their rights. And there was a material denial and whatnot, but what she focuses on is actually the legal representational denial, the ways in which Black women are not allowed to represent or cannot be represented under American legal jurisprudence. So in the first case, de Graffenreid versus General Motors, you have a case where a group of Black women brought a discrimination suit focused on themselves as Black women, that there was a case for statistical discrimination if you isolated the analytic category to Black women. However, the judge ended up deciding that Black women as such could not be allowed to be a discriminatory category. And if you looked at women as a whole, which was overwhelmingly white women, the same case could not be made for discrimination. And so in this case, you see that white women end up standing in for women, but more particularly that Black women are not allowed to stand statistically as themselves as Black women. At the next level, you have the case where a group of Black women came forward to act as representatives, both as all Black employees and all women employees. And in that case, precisely because they're Black women, they're denied their capacity to represent these two larger categories. And finally, in Payne versus Travenol, which in some senses is the most explicitly discriminatory in its interpretation of discrimination law, Black women were denied the right to represent Black men, pure and simple, because of a supposed overly significant gender difference. So if you look to the right, and this is where, certainly I might be off on this, but I was attempting something here. In the first case, when you have intuitionistic logic, you're allowed to say that that it doesn't have to be the case that something has to be X or not X. But if we assume that from the perspective of Crenshaw's critique that American law always is exclusive to gender or race, so one is always not to the other, then you could say that Black women are being forced into a position where they either have to be just Black or just women. But in this case that was brought up, what they were trying to say is we're neither P nor not P. We're actually a third category, which may be an intersection of these other two, but experiences discrimination in such a way that it should be treated as actually a third thing. In case of the second case, we have something closer to paraconsistent logic, where Black women were actually at the boundary in a almost literal set theoretical sense, where they happened to be at this overlap of all Black employees and all women employees. And then they were not allowed to, because we don't allow both something to be P and to not be P. But in paraconsistent logic, you can actually have contradictions at the boundaries. And finally, in the third case, Black women are Black, and by simple like Boolean logic, that means that they represent or are equivalent to every other member of the set Black. But the court simply decided that they are not allowed to represent being a member of the set to which they belong. So even basic Boolean logic can be denied discursively by courts, which on the one hand is part of why I constantly push against law being a model of mode B, because I think law is way more hybrid and weird. But also I think that this is just one example of many which go beyond law, of the ways that those who are at the most intersections of oppression are also systematically, logically kind of excluded from various modes of representation, either such that they cannot represent larger classes, nor that can they stand in as smaller classes that have to be considered in and of themselves. And so this kind of logic, when she analyzed it, was just at the intersection of gender and race. Obviously, in terms of this presentation, we've been looking at also the axis of being cis and being trans. But I think already we can begin to see here why trans folks would cause such a problem from the perspective of enforcing a certain kind of order of what it means to be human. Precisely because if we see here, we already have a situation where the courts are attempting to moderate and regulate how potential use of discrimination law, which from the perspective of the state and those in power is a concession, how we can limit the potential cascading effects of generously applying discrimination law. And that's precisely one of Crenshaw's main practical points, is that if you were to actually enable these kinds of logic of representation in their appropriate place, discrimination law would quickly demand much more in terms of you go quickly from remunerations to actual reparations if you were to carry this logic out to its extreme. I would propose then that that's exactly taken at an even higher level is what happens with trans folks. With the movement over the last decade-ish of increasing visibility and civic protections, both from the government, but also from the private sector of trans folks, there's a potentiality of opening up a certain kind of perception of the human, and I'll get into this a bit more in terms of winter in just a second, that really undermines a lot of the ways in which American nationalism is maintained. And like any other kind of nationalism, it's maintained fairly idiotically. You need to have pretty stupid adherences to pretty, like, on the face of it, dumb notions of gender and race to hold the thing together. To which then quickly becomes the question of, like, well, how do you make such, like, obviously wrong things compelling? How do these systems hold? So this is where I rely quite heavily on winter. So we'll turn to this. And I don't want, I put this all in here, but I will share this and let you all read it at another point, because there's a lot. But the gist of it is she details a number of transitions in the notion of human that go along with the growth of the capitalist system and its various stages of internal struggle of different rival classes. In terms of a definition of the human, which enabled both an ideology that legitimated colonization, but even more importantly, like the actual maintenance of colonization, in the sense that was deeply detailed by Frantz Fanon, like all the actual ways in which a sense of inferiority are instilled by the colonial system. What she's interested in is almost a transcendental deduction of what has to be in place historically in order to make such a thing possible. In order to do that, she calls for something that I think is a bit of a call to what we're trying to do here in the STP, which is the buck for such knowledge, one able to open up a new frontier of non-adaptive human self-cognition, therefore the possibility of our non-heteronomously and now consciously ordered motivated behaviors beyond the ethnoclass limits of our temporary one stop. But all of her sentences are like that. It's a ride. But the point being here that she is arguing for a notion of science, which is also what I'll get into later when I present on Bhaskar, that I think the STP is really helping develop, practically speaking, which can, study social phenomena scientifically. And part of that process has to do with the different stages for winter in which the scientific development in the West forced ideological rationalizations into ever more like kind of pseudoscientific forms. So she begins with the late medieval figure of the elect.
Did jump freeze for anyone else or just for me?
For me too.
Yeah,
Okay.
also for me.
So far as Black
No, you're
people
back.
were,
You froze for a second.
We lost you for maybe 30 seconds. So let me go back.
am I back yet?
Yes. For
Okay,
me.
cool. Or is it still dodgy?
It seems like you're fully back now.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so she does point out that there's a kind of proto white supremacy in feudal Christianity insofar as you had a notion of Black Africans having fallen the furthest from God, but she still positions it in a kind of perspective that was really no different. And she gives an example of people from the Congo who had a fairly similar inverted, in which the palest of people were the ones who had fallen or the most. So the problem really emerges, the thing that begins to specify white supremacy as something other than just like a general.
Yeah, it froze again.
a fundamental distinction between everything that was above the moon, which was fixed and in place, and everything that was below the moon that was constantly changing. And that was paralleled by the elite unchasteness of the church and the uncleanness of the lay people. When you have the breakdown in astronomy and physics, that makes it impossible to project those kind of narratives anymore onto physical reality. At the same time that the colonial system is being built, you have a definition of what she calls man one, which is based upon a new distinction between rational and irrational. And in this case, you have the first wave of colonial justifications insofar as those who were being colonized, those who were being enslaved, were not as reasonable, were not as capable of reason, or if they were only capable of reason insofar as they were tutored by the ultimately reasonable whites. And in this case, what had been God got transumed, is a word she uses quite a bit, transumed into this notion of nature. That helped legitimate a whole kind of period of consolidation of the states, what we generally call mercantilism and the early absolute monarchies. And she explicitly points out that part of what makes this early step from the feudal subject to man one is the focus on being a political subject. So part of what makes one rational is that one is a subject of a rational state. You can see this coming out in Hobbes and many others of the time, that without having a state, not just a group, but an actual abstract political state, you're not really capable of being rational. She then points to the conflict between the landless but more wealthy and increasingly more powerful industrial financial bourgeois against the older landed aristocracy and monarchies. And during that period, a new level of scientific detachment from narrative came in the form of biological sciences after Darwin. And so at this point, there's another shift away from rational and irrational to selected and disselected. And the selected disselected is now by a new form of transhumed God, which is no longer nature, but evolution. And so at a time when, especially after the fallout from World War II, a whole new justification and rationalization for the still widely extant colonial system required a much more explicitly pseudoscientific rationalization in the form of various kinds of eugenics or anthropologies, which were used to show the supposed, like, what she calls disselected, that there were many opportunities where evolution did not select certain groups of people as opposed to others. And so what we have is an increasing process over several centuries, where as the sciences increase in their scope of detaching scientific explanation from mythic narrative and essentially prohibit projecting supernatural explanations on increasingly more and more part of physical reality, in order to justify at this what was growing at the same time, which was an unprecedented global scope of hierarchic distinction, you had to force and push this rationalization towards a more and more pseudoscientific thing. And this is, I think, one of the key areas, again, that I think we have to offer going forward. What then had been the contradiction of the heart of the Darwinian revolution, at the core of its paradigm of evolution that was to give rise to, on the one hand, the continuing dazzling successes of the biological sciences, and on the other, not only the obsessive ethnobiological beliefs in the genetic inferiority of non-white natives and the barely evolved primate, the life unworthy of life, Nazis, but also the same time to C.P. Snow's two cultural division of knowledge. That is, to the natural scientific disciplines on the one hand, and the rigorous yet adaptive and therefore ethno-disciplines of the humanities and social sciences on the other. So when she later talks about non-adaptive social science, what she means by this is, whereas physics has reached the point where its method precludes the ability to instill mythic narrative in it. The human sciences are still essentially in the same place of what we used to call natural philosophy, that they still have an essential speculative dimension, which is part and parcel of them being adaptive. They can explain truth for a certain group of people, and she'll use this notion elsewhere, truth for, that what we call like rigorous scientific technique is breaking truth for and turning it into just truth depersonalized. And so social sciences, from her perspective, have yet to accomplish that detachment from being truth for a particular group and truth for, in a sense, that is looking to project some kind of narrative onto nature. So there's a problem that's posed in her work insofar as it's not enough to like critically point these things out. And I think this is another level for STP, kind of resonances with STP, is that 80-page essay is just phenomenal in terms of its critical capacities of kind of showing up the various ideologies and whatnot of colonialism. But continually throughout it, she calls for this thing that kind of goes beyond it in terms of a science of human organization, such that you can actually have something that enables you not to fall into this idea of truth for. So she's not calling for some kind of like rival truth for of the oppressed against the truth for of the oppressor. She's arguing for a non-adaptive, detached, depersonalized truth that, simply because it would be detached, would show the situation for what it is. The fact that the situation is oppressive, is hierarchic, will show through simply because that is the social fact of the matter. So the excuse me, I think one thing to stop at this moment before I go into some more specificities about trans and gender on this is that the current attack in the United States on trans folks is part and parcel of another set of attacks, right? And it's important that it's not just, I mean, obviously at a certain level, it is just kind of like an all-around attack on Black people or Indigenous people, but there are very specific fronts or ways of targeting that are going on right now that are going on for a reason. And one of the main, most effective things that the right has been able to do is attack this entity called critical race theory, which obviously exists in some level, but has become essentially anything that talks about the problems of racism, right? So it's one of those cases where the word itself quickly expands beyond its original context, and you find yourself defending teaching about Harriet Tubman as critical race theory. So those things can't be detached from one another. The fact that those both came out of DeSantis's Florida as part of the same overall program, the fact that they are highlighting and targeting in a certain way the capacity to develop precisely this kind of science that Winter is talking about. And, you know, I think as Marxists and a lot of our perspectives, we tend to be critical a lot of, you know, whatever studies. And there are plenty of reasons to over the years. But I think they're under attack. So that's its own reason. But also B, I think there's a lot that we still have to learn from those areas as well. I'll just leave it at that. But the point is that from the perspective of the attack on trans folks, the fact that it's co-launching with an attack on this thing called critical race theory and particular education about the history of racism, at the same time that you're talking about, quote, not exposing kids to any facts about queer people, has to do with a particular kind of approach to reproducing American society in all of its toxic glory. And I'll skip over this for a second, but it's already 2:50 or so. I'm going to jump over to here for a second. So one other person who now I'm looking at, I think I may have misspelled his name, Perdiabo. And this text is labeled Sylvia, but he's since changed his name. I can't recall right now, but I'll just go with Perdiabo. Develops ideas that run pretty well parallel to Winter's genres of the humans. So I'm going to kind of push there and then go one more area, and then I'll try to wrap this up because it's already, as per typical, all over the place. So we're probably familiar. I'm going to guess a lot of folks are familiar with Foucault's general idea of the movement from sovereign control to disciplinary control. And the basic ideas being that there was a kind of external methodology of discipline that was imposed in the 17 and 1800s in particular, that were part and parcel of disciplining a whole new thing called the working class, disciplining women in their new roles as housemakers, homemakers, and that he emphasizes the externality in particular, which is something that Perdiabo and what he calls the pharmaco-pornographic regime will emphasize is what changes after World War II. After World War II, and actually I'm just going to see if I can find it. Because it's just all right, he has a list of technologies here. I can't remember it. Can't find it at the moment. I just read a lot of this yesterday, so I apologize. But we do have essentially between the 50s and the 60s, you had development of a lot of basic sex medicine, the first kind of erectile dysfunction medicines, early psychotropic antidepressants. In the 50s, it was a clinician, a sexologist that coined the term gender. And what you have at that time is a shift from Foucault's emphasis on external controls to move internally. And, you know, this is a period where, you know, that culminates nowadays in the fact that there are razors for her, right? In other words, that gender becomes constructed not from the perspective of some outside kind of control, but actually enables, is able to be constructed through is able to be constructed internally. I'll just let his words get better. Gender, femininity, masculinity is not a concept, is not an ideology, is not simply performance, is a techno-political ecology. The certainty of being a man or woman is a somatic political fiction that functions as an operational program of subjectivity through which sensorial perceptions are produced that take the forms of affections, desires, actions, beliefs, identities. One of the defining results of this technology of gender is the production of interior knowledge about oneself as a sense of the sexual I that appears to one's consciousness as emotional evidence of reality. I am man, I am woman, I am heterosexual, I'm homosexual. As are some of the formulations that condense specific knowledges about oneself, acting as hard biopolitical and symbolic nuclei around which it is possible to attach a set of practices discourses. What I call gender programming is a pharmaco-pornographic technology for modeling a subjectivity that permits its productive or successive subjects to think and act as individual bodies. Hence, such gender-producing subjects understand themselves as delimited spaces and as private property with a gender identity and a fixed sexuality. The programming the dominant gender starts with the following premise: an individual equals a body equals a sex equals a gender equals a sexuality. So I think one of his main points here is that with the capacity, both in terms of the commercial construction of desire which is obvious in pornography itself, but his point is much larger. We see this in marketing, for example, all over the place, movies. There is a certain kind of, let's call it commodified organization of fantasy that is deeply internalized at the same time that we have an increasingly powerful capacity to activate or disactivate certain biochemical or metabolic processes through pharmacological intervention. And so there's an increasing interiorization of identity and therefore of self-repression that wasn't the case in the classic disciplinary era, which also importantly overlaps with most of what we consider the classic era of Marxism. This internalization, this interiorization of gender and its role in particular in holding together the nation state in the face of all the kind of atomizing and what's the word, derealizing processes, we can call it, of neoliberalism, of computerization, of big data, whatever you want to say. This structure has, as I'm proposing, played a key role in maintaining not just social cohesion abstractly, but in particular, the aggressive hostility and exclusive inclusive dialectic that makes nationalism, especially imperial nationalism, which has no possible ethical justification in and of itself, it makes it possible. And it's predicated on fundamental structures like Winter brings up in terms of the color line, such that American identity continues to be thought of in terms of whiteness, and whiteness continues to be the standard to which assimilation is held. But I think some of the work of and I'm not going to go into it too much because I've already gone quite a bit, but this is Sishu and Clement. The work of trying to understand how this order is reproduced does require looking at gender. Federici's work complements this passage right here quite nicely in terms of how the suppression of witches was part and parcel of what so-called witches, part and parcel of the enclosure of the commons in Europe. And one of the main targets of the witch trials were midwives, because they held a power of the actual reproduction of society that men, and in particular the emerging kind of bourgeois men in terms of doctors and professionals, did not have. And so they were vilified in ways that is very, very similar to what we're seeing with queer people right now. They were identified because they were participating in reproducing a natural act like reproduction. They had to be pushed into a kind of unnatural naturalness, anti-nature, where you're identified with like a she-wolf for eating your own children. And the point is that the midwife is identified as kidnapping kids as well as killing the parents of those kids. And you have this narrative from the right, which is predominantly actually about the victimization complex of these parents. But of course, the actual narrative is framed in terms of protecting the children. And I think there's a lot of reasons which I think would be probably better to hold off in conversation in terms of after the presentation. But the status of trans women in particular, because I don't want to leave out trans men, but the recent debates, including on the left, and a lot of kind of social media fiascos over the last year, in terms of trying to establish the relationship between trans rights movement, women's reproduction rights in general, which is really like the shift in the reproduction rights movement from a women's movement to a more general movement, has been a very challenging thing. But it also speaks, I think, to the entanglement of the question of gender in this very kind of broad sense of being a place of technopolitical ecology, where it's essentially holding together a lot of strings of the overall social system, precisely to the degree that it's actually not that real, in a kind of way. It's holding it together through a maintenance of an imaginary, which is the same kind of imaginary that Sishu and Clement over here want to explore. But it's an imaginary that will cover over this thing that Winter really focuses on, which is the fact that any one of our definitions of human is a definition of human, or what we call a descriptive statement. And so just to tie it back to Winter real quick, the actual visibility and growth, and especially amongst youth, the ongoing living as trans in American society right now brings to the fore the artificiality of a lot of what are supposed to be natural ways of living, natural forms of life. And that artificiality itself threatens, or the exposure of that artificiality threatens, this thing called American national identity. And so in order to maintain that national identity, you have to suppress not only discourse, but the actual existence of folks who are living proof of the non-existence of this particular order. And so I think the problem that poses in terms of being an organizer and a lefty and a commie in the US right now is, what does all this mean, and how do we tie this together? Precisely then moving outside of the limited American perspective, and this is a very white perspective. There's a lot of, for example, indigenous critiques of this framework. But in order to embed this movement and these questions into the larger questions of imperialism and colonialism requires that we have tools to kind of negotiate the embeddings of various kinds of categories of identity and life into a thing called a social world. Something like intersectionality was a major breakthrough in enabling this, and I think a lot of the tools we're developing in STP can help there. I also think, on the other hand, that there's a lot in these fields of queer studies and related anti-colonial and related and various other fields that do, I find, force me personally to like grow some of the tools of STP. And I think the actual political challenges of organizing a defense nowadays are very much open. So there's more I could get into in conversation, but that was already quite a bit. It's already past 3, and I'm not even sure if that made that much sense. So I think I'll call that a break, and we'll talk in discussion. So thank you all for that, and let me know what you think.
Should we take that short break before we go into crazy speculative debate and so forth? So we take 5, is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds like John already took 5, like, right? Okay, see you in a bit. John, is the file in our old Figma document? I couldn't find it there.
No, I just made a fresh one for this.
Yeah, no, but just because when I click on the link you sent, it sends me to the STP diagrams, the old one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Maybe I'm doing something wrong.
I'm sure I messed it up. Very on brand. Team project. Maybe it's because it's under team project. It's definitely not part of that.
Did you guys manage to open it?
I also go to the STP diagrams from
Yeah,
that.
same. Same.
Okay. It's like in my own team. I don't know why it's sending it to. I don't know. All right, what was the other option? I can export it.
Yeah. Yeah, there should be an export button. But I feel like we could do that offline, right? Maybe
Yeah, I just I didn't
now-
know if people wanted to have access to it or not.
Oh, yeah.
Not that I don't know if you'll actually be able to zoom in enough on a. Yeah, I don't even know. Yes.
I think Zoom has a zooming in feature now. If you want to share it again on the Zoom session. I share your
Oh,
screen.
just share screen. Okay. It's weird about that. Must be because it's something to do with the team status.
Try something here.
Okay.
Yep, nope. I really wanted to paste something in that document that but I don't know how to.
Why did it want-
Hey, John, did you try that share button on the top right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that didn't.
Yeah, I went here. I went here
Yeah, what happens when you click on it?
and I went to copy link.
Only people with you need to change go a bit up. Yeah, there.
That's
Anyone with the link?
well, it was set to that, but maybe I went back. So I'll try it again. I'm entirely. Oh, it's probably just being.
You can also start an open session, which it makes the requirements even lower.
Oh, okay.
Just by pressing that start button there. Yeah. But I guess Dennis managed to enter though.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. I guess maybe I didn't have it set to end. So. All right.
Yeah, now it opened for me as well.
Okay. Yeah. All right, then I'm going to stop sharing. It's too much of a responsibility for me.
There is a quote on top of. I think this just moved from one place to another, perhaps. Yeah, I'm not sure what this one.
Oh, I love it.
Can we, is it time to ask questions, or I had a question?
Sure.
I think we're probably there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so first of all, it's a great presentation. I think a lot of different ideas, as usual, is a very dynamic in terms of topics. And I wanted to just go back to this idea of protecting the children, because I think that's like the common thread, right? Both, if we think about like critical race theory in the US, abortion rights, and the assault on trans rights, like all three of them, the central figure that is like the fulcrum. It's not, the scope of the laws affects everyone, not just children, obviously, but the justification for the legal assaults are always to protect children. And I think you touched on something interesting with this idea of like the technologies of social reproduction, because like it does seem like children are kind of ideologically but also materially like key figures in reproducing society, right? So this idea of protecting the children is both like a moral battleground, but it's also this battleground, like a materialist, from a materialist standpoint, battleground over the means of, reproducing society, it seems like, right? So like, could you talk a bit more about that, that aspect?
Yeah. Yeah. I think yeah, that one, that's one of the areas, I mean, this is a bit of a cop out, but one of the areas I want to go into more later and explore. But I think one of my main references for that question is usually Silvia Federici's work. Because you see there, which is, I know there's like critiques of her work from within the trans community, and I totally get that exists. I still haven't delved into it, but like I see her work has always seemed really compatible, so I don't quite, anyway, so I get that there's stuff out there, but I think a lot of the issue, a lot of the question does come down to this idea of like the definition of the human and what Winter calls genres of human, because you see with like the changes of the paradigms, and particularly to the current status of children, like and it's not something Winter gets into too much, but I think you can develop it there, is like, in order to maintain a definition of the human, and especially one under like a hierarchical society, you have to have a pretty substantial notion of a distinction between children and adult. And in order to maintain a form of social reproduction that's constantly running up against people's both internal resistances as well as their like testing against reality. And a lot of I mean, and this goes like, I mean, you brought up three really good movements, but I think this goes even further beyond. If we go back to like the 60s, like there's been such an upheaval in how we think about educating and raising kids. When you look at how recent like actual laws around child abuse, actual laws enforcing education, actual laws, like these are all pretty recent things. And a lot of what I take parents' rights to be, and this is crude, but it's not necessarily the most, I don't think it's wrong a lot of times either, unfortunately. It's essentially the right to be an abusive parent. Is most empirical fact, but most of the people that are arguing for is that. And I think one of the key points is like, you need to have a lot of violence to raise kids to become the kind of people that want to maintain a nationalist society like the US. And part and parcel of like the defense of trans youth right now is calling into question the limits of a parent's sovereignty or ownership over their kids. That linking has been fundamental to the rapid capacity for capitalism to grow, because capitalism can't grow without a large portion of its own working class complicit in their own exploitation and oppression. And this is something that has been analyzed again and again and again from various levels, anti-colonial feminists within Marxist, is that there's this sick kind of jouissance or enjoyment of the power over family that has done a lot to set the working class back, insofar as it's internalized a kind of patriarchy at the level of workers. And so there's been a huge pushback against that. There's been a huge questioning of that across virtually every sector of American society. And when you lose that, you lose one of the main ways that you reproduce this insanely violent and delusional society. I think in a way, like allowing your kids to be queer is a current litmus test that is out there. And if that's allowed to exist and is legally protected, it shows up the actual abusiveness and violence in standard normal parenting, I think. And so, yeah, there's a key social reproduction, and there's also this like profound psychological investment that Winter gets into, that Sishu and Clement get into, this like enjoyment of dominating someone else to compensate for your own domination, being dominated.
So this is kind of inchoate, so it might take me a second. But I think like one thing that might be worth addressing in some capacity is the relationship of like transness to race. And there's been a lot of work on how the possibility of transition and the plasticity of the trans body like actually has a racial legacy, right? So C. Riley Snorton talks about this in Black on Both Sides. I know there's some related material on the biopolitics of feeling, but basically there's this idea that like partially because of the way that the historical, and Paul Preciado talks about this as well, the way that like the historical development of hormones and other technologies of transition was a form of racialized extraction. And if you think like via Spillers, there's a way that like one of the consequences of slavery was degendering of the Black body, that like the potential of transition in the imaginary kind of refers to that. And the idea of like a good transition, or like the idea of like good white transition, is like a racialized one that requires like the negation of Blackness. So there's a way in which like trans and Black are like two categories that have like a very strange relationship to each other. I think like the way that operates is mostly being written about by American scholars who are dealing with like a really particular like context. And I think that is something that is probably much more complicated internationally. It's not an area of theorization I know a lot about, but I feel like there's probably something worth addressing there if you're going to be talking about both at the same time, because there's a really big literature around that. So that's like the first thought. I wish I've read these things like more recently. I haven't read about Politics of Feeling yet. If you want to like make a thread for it on Discord and discuss that later, I'd be happy to read that alongside you, right? Or any other kind of format that people want to do this here. So that's kind of thought number one. And thought number two is kind of related about biopolitics of feeling, in the sense that like I haven't read it yet, but that book is really concerned with plasticity. And I think there's a way in which a major anxiety around transness, and I don't really know the plasticity flexibility distinction, how people are going to use that. So you know, people can feel free to kind of push on that. But one of the things that Jesper Puhr talks about in The Right to Name is this idea that like as she's talking about like queer theory as a machine of capacity. But you know, she's like, this is kind of problematic because as queer theory gives us ever more capacious ideas of what the body can do, everyone else is debilitated against the ever-growing expectation of queer potentiality. Right. So this is like a really negative thing that she understands about queer theory. And I think one of the fears of transition is like, oh shit, like if your body is that malleable and you can change it that way, right? Like what's to say that won't become a demand of you, like as a person or as a worker or as like as a way that you have to engage. So like there's a way in which I think like these like specters of like bodily oppression and extraction seem a lot more severe when people think about the plasticity of the body. And this is why you kind of get this twinned, I think, like ecstatic response and horror to a lot of like technology of transition. So like, you know, Paul Preciado, there's a bit where Jack Halberstam reads Preciado, and like Halberstam kind of does not like non-binary people, right? And part of the reason that Halberstam doesn't like non-binary people is that like, oh, they're engaging with these capitalist technologies. It's kind of the Janice Raymond critique on some level, that this is all kind of a capitalist grift to get you to buy gender technologies, because you know you're like supporting the capitalist economy and becoming reliant on that by engaging to that capacity. So this is like a site of intensified extraction. And like Puhr talks about this as well, that you know, it's like new gender formations are around something kind of like piecing. Which is the idea of like not having a coherent gender identity, but kind of building from all these kind of things you're taking as sort of like bricolage. It's like a capitalist bricolage. It's like actually very extractive. So there's a way in which I think like the wanting to fall back to like easily defined gender categories of like man and woman, that like this very like clear binary with clear delimitation, is that once you like flexibilize something and segment it more, you create more room for extraction there. And there's a way in which I think that's actually like I'm a non-binary person and like transphobia is bad, whatever. I think that actually like obviously, but I think that reflects maybe a kind of reasonable concern, right? That like wanting to go back to a certain kind of binary model is a refuge, appears to be a refuge from a certain kind of intensification of like capitalist extraction.
Yeah, those are, first off, thank you for the references. I'll be digging into that. And yeah, I've ever since the Dave Chappelle moment, kind of been, at least in popular discourse, not so much in theory, been tracking the very complicated relationship between especially Black American culture and trans culture. And so there's a lot to dig in there. So thank you for that. On the second point, yeah, I mean, that's actually really resonates with something I was just reading yesterday about a certain Amerindian indigenous critique of the way queer identities get taken up in indigenous communities. And that there's this kind of dual, like you have the emergence of Two-Spirit as an idea to kind of create an indigenous counterpart to that, but then there's critiques of even that kind of importing Euro-American ideologies into traditional indigenous gender roles. So you have like one in this context, it had to do with Navajo and the kind of four genders, which itself is articulated on two binary axes. You have like masculine man, masculine woman, feminine man, feminine woman. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot there. And especially when you start to look at the relationship between colonial gender oppression, colonial queer oppression, as it actually played out versus how that's conceived of by largely white and often middle class queer theorists. There's a lot there. So I think that's that. Yeah. So there's a lot there. And then finally, the thing that you really hit on that is, I think, critical is there is something like capitalism is brilliant, and there is something that Preciado's work really highlights that is so amenable to capitalist commodification and spectacularization and integration into the system. And I think that that's precisely one of those places where, because we don't have a good answer to that, it is a growth point for the far right. That's often the places where, especially like fascist politics, grow the most, are those places where there is some kind of understandable concern that the left has failed to adequately create space for in its own way. And I think that that's really at play right now. And that's so much of the limits of the defense for trans folks and queer folks in the US right now is so reactive, and like it's completely at the tempo is completely set by the right at the moment. That fact, you know, and especially given how much of activist circles are overlapping with various kinds of like self-commodification, influencer culture, content creation culture, all these things, it does quickly get difficult to address that concern you're bringing up, because a lot of people do make a living through some kind of way or another of commodifying identity, and that goes, you know, all the way down to like it just, yeah. So those are really good points. I don't have much more in response, even more inchoate, but yeah, those are good. So Gabriel.
Well, John, thanks so much for this. Ariel, also for your comments. I mean, I think it was a perfect continuation for our last debate. As you were presenting, I think it made the stakes of a lot of stuff we're doing clearer to me, like how it could help to pose different questions and frame things slightly different. But before, I even tried to systematize some of the stuff I would try to in a way I would approach it to see what you would think about it. But before that, the one thing that I think was missing, and to me, it's something that if we don't add, it can mud the discussion too much. Which is, I think that there is and I do think it has even a specificity to this, like a regional thing. I think it's a USA thing, which is to start from this, is the federalist starting point, which sounds like the best one, which is to map everything that is going on and then to pose the problem. How do we square this problem? Rather than start from things I know you are involved in, which are much more localized, but it's a much more concrete point of view. Because I feel like part of the American discourse about othering, about persecution, prejudice, violence, and so on, it starts from such a necessary comparative structure, and you need to be able to classify everything that's going on. Nobody manages to do it, so we never manage to actually get the foot out of the door and concretize a problem to answer, because the right can do it because it has no commitment to doing anything different, so it can speak generally. But if we're committed to doing something, we need to start in a more situated way. And I know you have experience with this, and I wonder how the challenges of, you know, helping to organize queer youth in some places and how these things get framed locally, you know, contrasts, but also kind of sheds a light on this bigger map. Because I think starting from the bigger map, it just looks like there's so many subtleties you need to take into consideration to make sure you're not stepping on so many conceptual toes that that should be legitimately properly, you know, arranged, that it's such a big task that you never get to say, okay, this sounds like an angle. So I just wanted to hear you a bit about this before I pose like questions that have to do with trying to systematize some of the stuff you mentioned in terms of what I think, how you could slice it up in terms of our system, you know?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And I almost framed it more explicitly in those terms. I didn't for a couple of reasons. First off, yeah, the gringo-ness of the thing is very spot on.
No, it's solidarity with that problem. That's not an easy context to work through these problems, man.
Yeah, so I think part of the my hesitancy is probably more personal than theoretical insofar as yeah, I didn't. Sometimes I feel weird about theorizing certain political experiences. I feel like I treat these folks like inevitably like something an object for analysis, you know. And these kids in particular, I just happened to meet at a time when I was completely disillusioned with the left. So they have like a very special, like, oh, okay, there's a reason to keep going. But that being said, it's funny that you talk about stepping on toes, because I think working with queer youth is one of the great reminders that like the folks that are actually in the crosshairs don't give a flying fuck about toes, because they've got a lot more like skin in the game, you know. And like these are some of the most like foul-mouthed, politically incorrect people I've ever met, but they're like also, as high schoolers, were way more committed both to each other in a kind of like honesty caring way, kind of agapic love, you know. They didn't always necessarily like each other, but they really understood having to be together, survive together, and have, I think, what do have a certain advantage, even if it still has a lot of work to go in precisely what you're talking about. There I don't know how else to put it, but like a lot of the young kids I worked with, it wasn't that they couldn't look at this top-down global thing. It's that they had already, in a weird kind of way, even at a very young age, recognized the non-utility of that. It's weird because it's like when you are like a lot of these Gen Z kids, they have like such a big amount of information about the world. And if you're in a small rural town like Montana, it quickly becomes dissonant. The potentialities, like exactly what Ariel was talking about in terms of like the potentialities of queerness and being queer in small town white America. And so like the exigencies of the local, the kind of like what is around gets much sharper, I think, for them. So I also think part of the problem, though, because of that, part of the reason I personally go to the global in these cases a bit more is because of the consistency of the counterattack. I think that's maybe the main issue, is that while there's a huge amount of local differentiation on, quote, our side, the fucking consistency of the right in this, at least in the US, because of the kind of top-down shadow dollar, blah, 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 Koch brothers, nada, 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 makes it much more systematized, I think. And so I was trying to conceive of this presentation more from the perspective of the right in a weird kind of way, in order to try to get how to better defend ourselves. But yeah, I do grant that like certain aspects got lost in that process. So that was a long, windy answer.
Yeah, no, sorry, I just wanted to make sure, like, I think you said exactly what I was curious about, which is not where does your political experience feature in this, like, objectively in this thing, but what appears as meaningful to the people you're engaged, politically with. Like, what is the things that make a difference to them? Like, they say, okay, this is a challenge that we're facing now. This is how they frame a problem, and so on. So yes, they didn't even suggest that you should frame it as a kind of objective analysis of some other that you're looking from afar. And I totally understand the prudence with how to approach things in a way that doesn't do this. The thing that just to conclude before I move on, I think Morris has a question that has a lot to do with what I wanted to ask too, because definitely, I mean, Vito just added a bunch of stuff here because I know he's researching a very, very similar question. I'm not even sure if you already spoke about it. So we in Brazil, we had part of a strong campaign against the Workers' Party candidate before Lula, so the previous election, was connecting the Workers' Party to promoting what they call the gay kids, which would be like a educational package that the Workers' Party would be implementing in school. So that was kind of our critical race theory panic kind of thing, and it had a major effect. And yeah, gender ideology. This is also the term that they use here a lot. I mean, I know this is a common theme, right? It's used in similar way. And so I'm just gonna throw this question there, but I mean, I think Morris can pick it up, and then don't need to answer now, but just to frame it in these terms, because I think that what I said that I think connected very well with the previous conversation we had last week, and I think it's already having a good dialogue with something that Michael is developing, because Michael has been working on community and affinity logic and black movement in Brazil and elsewhere, and racism and so on. And we've been discussing a lot how in our little schema for social atoms, right? You have the logical dimension, you have the minimal logical dimension, which is the atom. You have the material propagation of that difference, which we were talking last time Ariel was here, we were discussing this, right? And then you have all those things which are indifferent to that world, right? I try, even in your diagram, I added in your page, I added like a little thing for this. And I think that it's nice to divide the question. You can divide it into all these terms, and you can start seeing that there are actually many levels at which this is working. But one of the crucial ones, which I think it's the part why the battle falls on the body so directly, right? Because it seems like every time, like the thing that makes for how do you call this? Like the street smarts of the right, and why it propagates so nicely, and exactly the word you use, consistency, right? We have an explanation of what makes things socially consistent in our system, which is to find the terms in which material processes will propagate that difference regardless of our efforts, right? So it doesn't seem for anything that things that are deeply connected with the reproduction of human life, so traits that will be either passed along, for example, phenotypical traces, which carry information that is socially associated with race, or divides at the level of sex reproduction, the performance of sexual and gender roles, and so on. These things are so embedded at the level of social reproduction that you can just give it a kind of a little kickstart, and you don't need to do anything, and those questions will arrive at the other place, right? They propagate with very little noise corruption, especially if you're interested in the noise, not in the signal, which seems to be the case with the right? So I think that there is a underlying question, which I think it's below all of this, and it helps to start separating these issues rather than lumping them together, so we can see the subtleties, is why at a certain moment in American history were these questions framed the way they were, since people have been living their lives otherwise forever. So why at this time in this way, and how does this relate to community, family, social structure in the States? That's something I wanted to hear you talk a bit more about, And then I think that there is a problem, which is what Morris raised. I'm just gonna let him frame it because I think it's very, very good, which is that there is a difference you can see there between, let's say, things that don't get to be projected on the state to be properly regulated. So like a mode, it exists at the level of mode A. For example, though I think it's from afar, at least, I would be suspicious of taking some communities' sexual existence, and treating it as a model. That sounds like a bad idea. Some native population has some way of thinking through sex, and then you import it. It sounds weird, but the idea that some things which already have a right to exist at the level of mode A, when you project it at the other levels, which give it social efficacy in today's world, then it doesn't translate. It's different from things which, precisely because they translate, can be so well targeted, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which this can be separated into specific strategic problems. So yeah, I don't want to go into this. If you think it's useful, I can try to reconstruct the stuff afterwards, but just to kind of send it on the way of Morit's question, which I think was very good.
Yeah, I'll just pass it over to Maurice then and answer both questions.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the question was like, you brought up like many groups, like intersectional, trans folks, colonized and racialized people, even witches. The question was like how many different ways of how the state relates to them are there, or like there seem to be problems with people like who cannot be properly categorized, as you brought up with intersectionality, or queer people, or especially trans people. And there seems to be a case where there is an identity, but one which is fucked up, like which is an identity outside or other, especially in the field of reproduction. Also probably interesting because kids is also such a case, right? Mm-hmm. And the other question related to the last discussion, like there we had it that the state needs an outside which has already some pre-given meaning before it enters into the state, or when it enters into the state relates to it as something which already has a meaning. So there's a way of like naturalizing, which is inherent to the state. At least that was how I understood it. And I mean, there seems to be some connection to racializing, othering, categorizing, but I'm not so clear about like how this actually looks like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I'm not sure if I'm going to answer them the order they're asked, but I'll try to answer all of them by the end. Because in a way, yeah, I think starting with the first question you asked, Maurice, because I think, yeah, that's critical. Because if we use like Winter's idea of the genre of the human, the schema of white supremacy, or what she calls an ethnoclass, is just simply doesn't hold. Like, it's not correct. It's takes a bunch of pieces and types and pushes them together and builds on and transforms a previous distinction of the human. But the very project it's trying to rationalize, both in the sense of justifying, but also in the sense of making it easier to carry out, like to give a better pragmatic framework to exercise colonialism, does require precisely these kind of like oversimplified categorizations of, exemplary human, exemplary subhuman, exemplary man, exemplary woman, which was already easily integrated as like a partial man, because that went all the way back to Aristotle. So you had these ideas that required that the distinctions be made on a slippery surface where one was better than the other. And so yes, you had a much more explicit exterminatory practice, and you can see this in the witch trials within Europe and in many of the targets of outright. I mean, obviously, there was just a lot of exterminative violence in colonization in general with regards to indigenous peoples, but there's been the way sexual violence was used and the way that queer indigenous folks were singled out precisely because they couldn't be fit into the colonizing Christian gender order, which remained more or less the same, even though it kept getting different rationalizations. The what it means to look like a man and look like a woman and perform being a man and perform being a woman, that part hasn't changed that much. It's just the shrouding of it in some rationalization that has changed. But I think the other thing that plays in this, though, and that ties into the second question, is a lot of the distinctions, like a lot of the places where it became not necessarily okay to be queer, but where the state no longer cared that much, was within the increasingly private domestic space. And I'll frame this in terms of like future research, because honestly, I don't know enough about the history of colonization to speak to this. But I think one of the ways that states in colonized areas were built, they had a strange relationship, especially before the 20th century, with various indigenous groups, because they were still being integrated and they still had access to areas or territories or whatnot that required the state to work with them temporarily as allies, or to try to like take up, quote, native knowledge about areas in the process of colonizing. And so the way that the colonizers were successfully able to kind of filter out bits of useful information while still having this rubric that indigenous cosmology and culture was inherently irrational, I think that this process has a lot to do with this inside-outside thing, right? Like on the one hand, for example, what we now call like trans folks or queer folks had a lot of traditional roles within Navajo society. So on the one hand, you had to kind of erase the potentiality of being, quote, a masculine woman or a feminine man. But at the same time, when the U.S. tried to integrate, this isn't so much the state, but it's more the ideology that justifies the state. When the, quote, romanticized wise Indian was used as a kind of backdrop to justify the westward expansions, like, yeah, they didn't deserve it because they're wise, but they weren't quite like able to live up to the needs of assimilation. That story required simultaneously erasing a whole group of people that maintained the actual culture of the indigenous who had been exterminated, and telling the story in this perverse way that erased them, because one of the things Winter emphasizes is these rationalizations point to the actual damage that's been done by colonization, but then rationalizes that damage as being inherent to the inferiority of those people. And so in order to maintain like the story of the legitimacy of colonization itself, the states have to constantly like interpret reproductive labor in ways that erases it, acknowledges it, explains it, doesn't explain it. And I think that has a lot to do with it. That was really rambling, I'm sorry, but like I said, I'm still trying to like tease a lot of these ideas out. Gabriel, just to clarify, when you said why did these roles change at this time, what time you mean, like immediately, like recently, or?
I meant like for example, in Brazil, I think that there is different. I mean, there are two levels in which you would say there is ongoing systemic violence against all type of minorities and majorities, because I mean the place of Black people in Brazilian society is very different than America. But it's different to see it instrumentalized as part, for example, of electoral campaign. To say, imagine like right-wingers brainstorming where the attack is going to go and say it's going to go on this point. This wasn't a common tactic of the right until a certain point, right? And I mean, you don't even need to focus on Brazil. Even European fascism wouldn't focus explicitly on certain things, right? So there seems to be a change in that direction. It can be seen as perhaps a reaction to the political movements themselves. It can be seen as an instrumentalization of something which, with social disintegration at the level of, for example, the family, right, which certainly took a longer curve to get affected in the global north, you know, in terms of dismantling of a certain promise, you know, of family structure. I don't know what it is, but certainly there was a change in the way that this gets instrumentalized by like mainstream political discourse, right? So I think that there is a big way of framing a way of framing a very big problem or big question, which is how would we describe this deeper social transformation that would then allow this question to propagate and to really frame a debate? Because even if it was posed many times, these types of scares, you know, you should be afraid of this and that, it rarely was posed in this particular way with this level of social efficacy, you know. Yeah. So yeah, in that sense, you know. So now I don't mean by like last 2 years, but probably last 10 years, perhaps.
Yeah, I think for me, and this is very, you know, subjective, anecdotal from my perspective, but like so much of it has to do with the turning point of COVID and the lockdowns, because you saw during COVID, that's when you had simultaneously more or less, I can't remember his name, but you know, the Hungarian right coming down on I believe it was licenses or identity cards in Hungary, and at the exact same time, more or less, the Idaho state legislature here was the first to pass. And again, I kind of remember the particulars. There have been so many, but it was the first major state-based anti-trans legislation. And from then it just exploded. And I think, you know, again, I think it does have to do in part with a failure of more traditional attack targets not working. You know, like some of the more classic race baiting hadn't worked. Some of the more classic queer baiting hadn't worked. But now that you're mentioning it, I'm thinking about more. I do think that also, again, this relates something to what Ariel said, which is like the fear of plasticity. Like the converse of that is also like the fear of like of our risk as we learn more about what can kill us, essentially, right? Like the internal threat of COVID, the very like bodily, very like unpredictable vector nature of COVID, I think produced a fundamental anxiety in a lot of people, and the right wing responded in a very right wing like way, which was very simple and very tenacious and very cunning, I should say, on where that anxiety would land politically, right? And the potentiality, this internal plasticity of gender, and especially as it like is signified and kind of reflected in like an increasing queer presentation by today's youth in the US. I think those things are very interlinked, right? Like without, you know, there was the actual political defeat, the economic defeat, but there was also just something so particular about that moment in global consciousness with COVID and with like what was going on, that they were trying a lot of things. Like I remember this was when QAnon took off, which was just like linking all the conspiracy theories together into one major one. Like the right was trying a lot of things, but I think for a lot of reasons, but I hadn't really thought about the COVID ones until just now. A certain kind of body anxiety was really playing into it. but yeah, just also I think a lot of defeats by the right and cycling on something, and then that ties back to these larger questions about the relationship between gender and nationalism. So, Victor.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a very interesting to try to mix the STP theory with this problem. I think it was very good. I was thinking two points. The first was like there's like a weird center periphery relationship in this question, because I posted a link there in 2016. There was like one of the first attempts I remember in America of like trying to ban unisex bathrooms in North Carolina, and it failed badly. Like there was like an economic boycott, and even Trump said, "Oh, transsex can use any bathrooms they want." And like now in 2013, it's inconceivable that any Republican candidate will say anything like that. Like, I don't care about that. That's stuff that doesn't matter. So I was thinking maybe what changed since then? Why did it become so important? And when I was researching this stuff, like I talk a bit with Gabriel and other people about it. There was like the latest bills banning trans people, gay, sex, and other identities in Africa. There was like a very heavy relationship of American lobby trying to like legitimize it in African countries. And then there was like a movement in the far right that's like in Africa, where there are traditional communities, they don't accept this transgender stuff and stuff like that. So it's like they went to the periphery so they could come back to the center and stronger. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's a bit important to like to see the relationship between the imperial and the periphery in that sense. And there's another stuff that's a bit less important, but I think it's in that report that Ariel shared, there was a specific focus that like to make it possible for us to win, it is important that we focus on trans children. So we start with the 18 to less, and then we go further. But if we focus on the non-adults, on the children, we can win. So that's like another important, and I think it's related to that what Dennis said. And why do you think that work? And if is that specific to the US? I think it isn't, because the focus on children is like in Brazil too, in another sense, that has been the approach for like 10 years or so. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I got a lot of thoughts on the whole thing with where the kids are concerned. And a lot of it's where, you know, I do think whatever role psychoanalysis still does have in political analysis, it's probably one of the places where it's worthwhile to explore. I'll say at the moment, because there's like a lot there, is would be hilarious if it weren't so horrifying, the consistency with which so many of these groups that scream the loudest about protecting the kids often harbor predators, if not are formed by predators. And so I think my really dumbed down analysis of the whole thing would be that, you know, so much what the right wing is defending is inherently predatory. They cannot not conceive of anything else as not falling outside of that kind of predation. So while on the one hand, there's an obvious disingenuous, bad conscious, blah, blah, blah manipulation, I think that there's also like a more, like there is some fundamental stuff going on around people's own place in a violent system and what they think of as being, how they like conceive of the world based upon what they themselves do in the world. But again, that very quickly gets outside of my capacities and my ability to speak to it. But a lot of people have commented in many ways how capitalism like undermines family structures, and again, COVID forced a lot of people to realize how kind of broken the family is when they all got stuck. And so there's a lot there. I don't have a good answer beyond the ramblings I just rambled though. So I'll pass it over to Adiel.
I'm hanging out. The circles I hang out with a lot of the time is kind of the weird trans family abolitionist circles. I think there's a lot going on here that's useful. But kind of another thought I had is, I think like there are a few, if you're looking at like the history of this, I think there are actually several currents that may be kind of worth disambiguating in some capacity. And one of them is the kind of like far right-wing response, which, you know, has been ongoing, but also like this legislative push, like I kind of linked to, can be pushed to, I think, like a really small moment, who, if you really wanted to get into kind of the rhetoric and the nucleus of that, can like really be tracked. There's a very kind of obvious right-wing legacy here that works a particular way. I also think, and this is true in the American context, though it's much clearer in the British context, there is also like a liberal, you know, quote unquote center-left legacy that goes on here, right? And you see it in the way that like being a transsexual was added to the DSM as like a diagnostic problem, the same year that being like a homosexual was taken out, right? Explicitly. And there's a very kind of long push in, you know, like that goes back to like the 70s, 80s in queer spaces, that has been kind of this respectability politics, gentrification, pushing of trans people to the periphery, right? And you hear people like Silva Rivera talking about their frustration with the way that the gay liberation movement went. So I think there's a parallel, but also useful to discuss, kind of like liberal, I don't want to say left, obviously, legacy of transphobia that you see like in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Or by people that like ostensibly describe themselves as Democrats. That's like also significant. And I think probably it's useful analytically, and also to get a handle on this phenomenon, like where the anxieties come from there, and how that's like different and distinct, and how these things align or they don't. Because I think like there's maybe a unified, in some sense, like transphobic front politically in some respects, but I think they're actually motivated differently, and they're situated differently. Mm-hmm. And it's important to not understand this as a fully right-wing push. Yeah, well, that's that thought.
That makes a lot of sense.
John, would you mind if I just try to see if it helps, just to share the screen with that little segmentation of stuff, to see if it helps to separate some of the issues?
Yeah, do it.
So yeah, no, I just added this thing here. My idea with this is just to take that little thing we did last time. This is just a, oh my God, where's the grouping thing here? This is that little drawing that we discussed, used as a basis for discussion last week, right? So if you look at it, what you get here, just as a summary, what you get here is that idea that, you know, a social world has its logical dimension, and by logical dimension, you just think of the stuff that makes a difference in a context, and you want all these contexts which are socially relevant to be cohesive with one another. again, the word that John used, like the consistency of it is important, right? And I think that it's a discussion we never had the discussion directly, but our theory presupposes that people are willing to die for consistency in a way, or to kill for consistency as well, right? More often than not. So consistency is a type of wealth. It's a type of thing you want to optimize for. To be able to map the world is not like a bonus. It is what sociality is in a level, right? But that doesn't come to the point now, though it does make an important sense. It has, I think, an important role to play in a lot of these discussions, because we know that part of what these tropes that the right puts into discourse circulation address that issue more than anything concrete. They address the problem of making something consistent, right? And they are as consistent as they make someone's lived experience consistent with the rest of the world. It says, your world is in crisis. It's because of this. So it has a because structure. That's very relevant. I don't think it's for nothing. So, but anyway, we have the logical dimension, and then we said, well, we have the minimal dimension of what makes a difference, which is the atom, which is like the smallest brick of the world you create that preserves what is meaningful in that world, right? So for example, for the logic of commodity, we know that being able to talk about anything in terms of value, even though value is not anything in particular, is what allows you to stitch any economic situation together, right? Any context together. But, and this is what we were trying to explore recently, how do these little bricks get constructed? Because if we had to construct and enforce them in every case, that would be so time consuming. Let's say the epistemic cost of pushing things in one direction, if it goes against the grain of reality completely, everything is green and we say everything is blue, it's costly because you need to abstract away from really present traits, right? That impose themselves all the time. So if you associate yourself with the color green and everything is green, it's easier to keep consistency. So the question is, what are the material bases that propagate the atomic content that is meaningful, right? And the form. And then you get everything which is there but doesn't make a difference. And the way that we distinguish these two things is that the atom has to do with something you can unpack and you can compose and decompose. It functions like a brick, but the material process is like a black box. You don't need to be able to look inside of it. So it's also a black box in the sense that you can fantasize its content, but you might not look at it, but you do need to rely on it. And in many ways, a lot of the struggles we're focusing on today, they have a very specific site in between these two things, right? They go through a place where life can't but pose these problems. Human life is obliged to pose problems connected with, traits in your color, in your body, and so on and so forth. So they both latch on to this, and this propagates some differences rather than other, or at least a certain social structures want these traits to be propagated, but they also make it impossible to pretend like these issues don't exist, because every time these issues must be reposed, right? So I separated these four levels here. There are the logical constraints on visibility, which have to do with what is a form something needs to take for us to say it makes a difference in a context. So if you package, a certain gender performance in a very commodified way, individualized way, and conforming with certain things, it makes it easier for it to be adopted, recognized, seen, and so on and so forth. If you're framing it, or you need to frame it in a way that doesn't conform to whatever these constraints are, it's harder, right? Then there is a second level, which is what we're calling this atom. And I think that the core function of this, which we didn't discuss, has to do with, once you have the building block, you can generate new building blocks. So for example, clearly the most stable building block in a capitalist world is a white cis male who works. That little building block is meant to be the most stable thing you can get, like a white male citizen who works, right? And who is cis. It's like you want to localize everyone else with regards to that. So you localize every other race with regards to the white race, which is the non-marked one. Every, gender with regards to. So you do this kind of as the indexing of what it means to belong. Everything else is degrees away and is evaluated with regards to that. So that's, let's say, discussing white male supremacy as a grammar, right? It's giving you the syntax to structure things. That's slightly different than this question of what forms things must take to be visibly counted in a certain social structure, which I think that's why understanding what's going on in the States in the last decade, it's meaningful to know what you need to be to exist, right? And then, but the question of how is it negotiated with this grammar, and where do you end being localized at the margin or not of this well-marked, well-established atom is a separate question. Then there is a question which I think distinguishes things even further, which is what are the material bases for propagating the things that make a difference, and how do things which do not propagate those same differences, at which point do they touch? For example, a lot of racial discussion goes through colorism because phenotypical mixing doesn't respect clear ideological markers of race. These things they are not natural, they're not physiological. Because race is not physiological, it's just propagated partially by physiological traits, right? It negotiates with a asocial dimension, but the fact that asocial dimension can take many forms, can go to many places. So there is a tension at that level, but it also indicates different processes which get politicized. So something connected to sex, sexuation, something connected to the propagation of phenotypes. None of those things are social in and of themselves. And none of them are just the way they are absorbed by a social system, right? But understanding what is that the social system counts on, you get to understand perhaps in which way certain forms of life, certain communities challenge that. They might not challenge because they are challenging this. They might not be challenging the grammar. They might not give a fuck of how they're seen. But just the very fact that they exist and, let's say, derail a certain propagation, for example, the constant fantasizing about, not, let's say, blocking or disrupting processes of family building between inheritance and childbearing because, you're not a cis woman, for example, right? It's not so much happening at the level of how you're seen, so much the material fact that you're saying, okay, no, at this point, no difference that makes a difference to you will guide how I behave and who I partner. That's a different question, right? It's not exactly the same, I think. And then there is, let's say, the level of things that are remaining different in the sense that they are happening, they are structured, but they simply are seen as being inconsequential. And the only way they become consequential is if you latch on to this upper level. So I think that we could use all these different dimensions here to distinguish different, like to facilitate separating, for example, in which sense the challenges of the Black movement struggle in the States are different, are connected but different to the struggles, of the trans movement in the States, because how they are atomically localized is different. The way that you generate, let's say, a valuation of race out of this main index of white male cis worker is different, right? For example, I just posted a quote by Toni Morrison where she says, look, the role of inhumanity ascribed to Black people in the States, it's clearly a fraud because they rely on us to raise their children. How would they ever do it if they really believed what they were saying, right? But it's totally different with the moral panic around the trans community, for example, where there isn't this double bind. It's very different. So you can start separating, because the way that racism latches on into the material traits that propagate racism is different, right? It's almost like a lot of things can happen as long as we can keep track of racial divides to reproduce inequality in a macro scale, right? So I can, let's say, be magnanimous about friends and workers and so on, you know, and things so on, because I can't be flexible at the micro level, but the macro structure remains. So, for example, structural racism became a politically important word to point to the fact that it's not your immediate connection with somebody that is signaling the political problem, right? Something like this didn't appear. Like structural transphobia is not needed as a term because immediate transphobia is already the core problem in a sense. So you can start seeing that by making these distinctions here, even though at the level of this it's similar, right? The struggles at the level of representation, recognition, space, opportunity, they do meet at some point, of evidently, right? At the level of how they are constituted as problems for a white supremacist society, they're going through different routes because they are produced by different processes, right? So that's why I kind of separated these things here. Like, I think that these are different questions. Like, what forms must life take to be visibly counted? And it has more generally to do with this. And clearly, let's say, if you have a stable job, and if you're rich, that puts you in a certain level of protection that's different from other things. So you can see that, let's say, intersectionality, there's logical intersectionality at this level here you need to discuss. And I think that this is also where the problem of aligned and misaligned tensions should enter the picture. You said, like, I didn't connect with the conjuncture issues, but I also wonder, and I've seen this in Brazil with patients of mine, transphobic patients for whom the trait that they focus on about the object of their phobia is the fact that these are people who know how to live in precarity. They don't have a expectation of some level of alignment in their lives between their communities are not recognized. They work in a like a lot of freelance jobs that are, you know, supported to their own mutual networks. Ultimately, the person is scared because they're anticipating a future that they can also arrive at, which is a future of precarity, not a future that has anything to do, you know, with being trans. So I think that that's a tension that you can see here that is to show that alignment and misalignment in our theory can itself already play a role, right? Then I think that this issue with a grammar and how things get measured, like the very language of a situation is constructed, could also be a separate way of framing this, because you might find out that in order to, that there is, let's say, a social scale of othering that you can actually formally construct. I mean, Eugenia Chang did it in a way very simply, right?
I was thinking about that the whole time you've been.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think that there is these issues here, which I think are more fundamental, of course. Let's say there are material processes which are very central to a social formation, and they're protected. For example, I suggested above in the chat that, well, if you take this to be, you know, a white cis man who is working and therefore contributing to society as a citizen, if that's the basic unit of white supremacy, you have to reproduce that. You have to reproduce that. You need children, but children are contingent because it will be a mixture of, always a mixture of that, by definition, of that atom and another. By the very definition of how that atom is structured, because if it was structured differently, it wouldn't be with another. If it was just a person, the atom, it would be that atom reproducing with itself. It wouldn't be that at the edge of the void, right? But the child is everything that a white cis male working is not. It's not necessarily white, depending on who's not the white man. It's not necessarily cis. It's not working, right? So you're obliged to stitch that atom to something contingent, like something that holds something which is unsure, uncertain, right? So it does make sense that the more threatened a society based on this particular atom is, the higher the fantasies about the type of protection that child needs to have, right? Because the higher the degree of heterogeneity, and then you say, okay, but how can I guarantee that what's going to be socially reproduced out of this generation of white cis males are also white cis males? Well, now you need to focus your attention on children. So there is at this level here, right, there is explanation of why perhaps all these things focus on either early childhood education or the whole thing with grooming and so on, right? It is, let's say, the void part, the empty part of the white supremacist atom. It needs to reproduce, therefore it needs something other, but you want it to be the least other as possible, right? And then I think that this needs to be separated from this whole question here, which is also why I asked you about how would you see the whole thing from the political point of view, because there's still the issue of separating things that exist but remain invisible and simply go on unseen as if they're inconsequential. So what people are doing with their lives, simply nobody cares, right? It's different from things that as soon as they emerge, they need to be cut at the root, right? And things that are allowed to exist, allowed to be seen, but not allowed to have consequences. I think that that's also a separate thing. So for example, there is a certain way of integrating white gay men in American society that looks like you're allowed to exist and to have a certain level of social conformity, as long as this doesn't have certain type of consequences, which could be extracted. And as far as I can see, is a constant debate with a wider queer movement, which is there are consequences to be extracted from this, which are not just the ones that already fit, right? So I have the impression that like with the schema that we're building, you can actually separate all these things, and then they still have deep connections, right? But you can get a bit more of singularity across, I think. But I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously I'd want to go back and kind of like parse it all out in those terms, but I think it helps to clarify things. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about that early on, I don't know if Maurice is still here, but going to his question about kind of the distinction between kind of not being categorized at all and being oppressed because of that versus being oppressed because you fall under a particular category. And I think that we talked about consistency, but there's the other side of that as well, which is completeness, right? That we are able to account for everything in our system. And I think that that's both the consistency and the completeness are things that are impossible goals that the colonial capitalist system, what have you, is always trying to enforce, where it can't enforce ideologically, it has to enforce through violence in some ways. I think trying to map out those dynamics in terms of the analysis you're posing makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I just mostly agreed with what you just said, so I'm gonna just let it stand.
Can I just complete with one thing, which is the reason why I posted a Toni Morrison quote, in fact, because I really specifically wanted to hear you about this, because when you bind together, like, this is how I read today the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, which I think it's much more tragic than we realized at the time. We, by me, I'm communist. Because if you read how it's written, it says, there is a specter. All the forces are gathering to exercise that specter. So the structure is, it's not that there is a communist movement and all the reactionary forces are gathering to exercise the communist movement. They're really concretely getting together to exercise a specter, meaning there's a small communist movement, a big specter, because anything small and new produces big waves, and they are using the waves to organize against the small movement. which is what Marcuse called a counter-revolution without a revolution. And the 1848 revolution was kind of like that. It was everywhere. Okay, it's more than just a counter-revolution, but it does have the lasting effect was a bit like that. All the powers, real powers, being organized around the spectre, against the spectre. And when I put it in these terms now, for example, you don't need anything real to look at a void. You know there is a void. For example, the void of this children black box, which attaches social reproduction to contingency. You don't need much, just a hint of something new to organize all the reactive powers against the specter of what could emerge there. And then there is always the fear, and I think that's what Toni Morrison is pointing at. She says, if you engage with undoing the right's view of that specter, you lose time. And it's meant to be a distraction because it makes a bargain with you. It makes you look bigger, like you're a bigger force than you really are as a movement, because you're really small. You're just like a spark. And they only need a small spark to organize a huge, because they're always looking for, they can't produce novelty. So how will they justify movement on the right? They will look for sparks on our side. Then they're going to amplify the spark into a real big menace. And then they organize and try to capture and frame in their language that specter, not the real thing. They have nothing to say about real movements. Like, what do they say? They don't publish articles saying, you know, that really that support group in the trans community, it's actually doing terrible things. They don't even mention that it exists. They talk about inexistent things, right? And I think that Toni Morrison's point in this paper is there's something about racism in the way that it is constructed by the right, which is meant to capture you in an endless debate, whereas in doing the work never gets done because that the work is then concrete, right? And for example, this happened with the communist movement recently. Like there is a return to criticizing, like to anti-communist speech, but the bargain is we are allowed to think we're much bigger than we are in terms of our political power if we identify with the specter. But then because it's a specter, we have no power, we are on the hands of the right. Right. So I wonder if you see that difference between what actually appears as tenable and constructive from the ground up, politically speaking, being divergent from not only the discourse of the right, but the referent of that discourse, which doesn't seem to be what truly can emerge out of this black boxes of the social world, things we don't know what they are, but it's just the fantasy that they put on top of that black box, right? Yeah. So see my point, like there's something about that mismatch which seems productive.
Yeah, no, I think that, so one way to form that would be in terms of Preciado's own work, which is essentially like, in order to address, you know, it's almost, he doesn't use these terms, but it's almost like the old classic Marxist argument, right? Like, as the like forces of biotechnology and digital media like expanded, there were new potentialities that had to be like locked down. And in that locking down, you have what he calls like gender programming, insofar as you begin to institute a whole bunch of internalizing procedures, which like are so trivial as to like we lose credibility, like horoscopes, right? Like horoscopes, newspaper horoscopes are one of those things that can be easily dismissed as just pure nonsense, but like they almost always have like tons of gender coded advice and things in them, and there's a ton of that. And I think, yeah, you get, it's interesting because it's like you get on like scientific paper like a lot of like technical variability that's suddenly enabled through pharmacology in particular, but yeah, the question of whether or not that actually has that many repercussions, what those repercussions are, and it's like a lot of it's a commonplace in a lot of, I think, oppressed like discourse and whatnot, but like the expectation that a trans person has to be something above and beyond a typical person because they're trans plays into that. But that being said, like I do think that much like the specter, and I think this actually ties to what Victor was mentioned about like the increasing identification of the right with teachers as groomers, like teachers themselves, the profession of being a teacher, being suspicious to grooming. There is this, I think, ongoing thing about social reproduction that, you know, part of the specter, as I interpret it, was the communist movement was very small. It was not in proportion to the amount of people who had been forced into being workers, but there was a sense that could translate very quickly from potentiality to actuality, right? Like that specter was also that sense of potential actualization of the specter, which wasn't unreal. It may have been exaggerated, but it's certainly, however unsuccessful the workers' spring was, it was fairly unprecedented in terms of scale. And I think that that's a similar kind of thing. Like there does seem to be an unprecedented opening to the mode A familial structure of reproduction. But I think one of the things we're seeing, especially like if you look at like a lot of white, like polyamorous communities, which is supposed to be breaking the core almost ontological structure of the family because it's no longer monogamous, and yet they're capable of reproducing all kinds of bourgeois, racial, gender, et cetera, right? So yeah, I think that there often is a huge mistranslation between any group and the potential variation that comes out of that and the actual variation because of the overall structure of social reproduction still remaining in place. So for example, does the right wing actually have a good sense of, could capitalism or the social order be overturned if trans kids were allowed to be trans kids? I doubt in isolation that would make any difference. So there is a mismatch there. At the same time, it's part and parcel of a larger question about social reproduction that if that took off, could have transformative capacities. So I think that there's this like weird ambivalence between the mismatch and the potentiality that's like gestured from that mismatch or something like that. But yeah, those are all good points. Ariel?
So this kind of might be me kind of misunderstanding talking about invisible and consequential structures, but this kind of spurred a thought that I have, which is I guess they're kind of like two components of it. Number one is like, one thing that's worth thinking about is like the extent to which Obamacare really created the possibility for a lot of trans people to actually transition, right? Especially like, you know, trans people below a certain income threshold. And like that wasn't at all possible. And that's like a historical factor. And I think part of what's concerning about that moment is like the simultaneous like proliferation of something and the fact that it's like so integrated and potentially invisible, right? There's a way in which like, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but like I think the image of who is a trans person in the United States changed over the course of like 20, 30 years, right? Because I think of like, you ever see the Ace Ventura movie? Right?
It's been a long time, but
it's been a long time. I recently saw this clip again, right? But like the whole plot of that, like the whole horror there, right, is that like, oh, the villain is trans, right? Mm-hmm. And what's scary about this like villain being trans is that they're like a white person that is like relatively attractive, that is like class fluent in ways of communicating, right? And that like he couldn't tell, right? And that's why there's that long sex gag. He's like, oh, I couldn't tell, and then I had sex. I almost, you know, I like interacted sexually with this person, and then I'm so kind of utterly horrified, right, by that whole thing. But there's a way in which I think like part of what's scary about trans people, and there's this kind of like repetition compulsion that people have in like transvestigating, or like, you know, a lot of my trans friends will post a selfie on Twitter. and people are like, you'll never be a man. Like everyone can tell, right? There are people that spend their entire day on Twitter looking, like responding to pictures of trans people being like, oh, I can tell what your assigned sex at birth was. And I think there's a concern around a drifting into perceptibility that is motivating that. Like you wouldn't do that if you weren't profoundly anxious about not being able to tell who is and who isn't trans. Right? Like that's like clearly a reaction to that in some capacity. And like this is the way that I think that it's something that maybe like transness and gayness share in some sense that like you don't have around race necessarily, except in like certain formations. Like there's this book called The Operated Jew by Oscar Panizza, which I think is kind of interesting. That basically it's about this Jewish person who does all these surgeries to look Aryan, so he can sleep with Aryan women. But eventually it can't work and he melts, right? But there's a related anxiety and sort of fascination with this idea of like, oh, what if these people are like completely invisible and soluble in society?
Mm-hmm.
And like, what are the consequences when that happens? And that becomes a lot bigger of a deal when like your entire encounter with trans people is not some kind of like group that's like a precipitate that like can't be, or that's like not soluble in society. Where you have sort of like where your main figure of the trans person is like the sex worker on the street. That's like very visible and is not participating economically in the same kind of structures. Because part of what gender does, right, is it's produced in the workplace. It reproduces the workplace, right? If people are participating in the economy and circulating normally, it's a lot scarier. And I'm kind of maybe rambling, but I think what this goes back to is that like, a lot of like treatment for trans people historically, in terms of like treatment guidelines or like institutional support, involved like not being visibly trans, right? There's a lot about like, how do you pass, right? How is this not a visible or consequential thing in your life? And like being a good, proper trans subject historically has been like, no, like you want to be stealth. And part of that is like, you look at treatment guidelines and it's like, no, like you should be doing a job that's appropriate to a woman. If you're a man and you transition to being a woman and you don't want to do a woman's job, that's like problematic. And that might, end up barring you from being able to transition, right? Or might be a thing you get a ton of pressure put on you to do, is to like change the job that you're doing. So there's a way in which like, I think there's like the simultaneous desire for, but anxiety about what it would look like if trans people were to become completely kind of normal people and then sort of dissolve into society, which I think is really interesting. And that strikes me as particularly American. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I certainly I'm not the best person to kind of report on how the discussion about passing, not passing, so on happened, for example, in Brazil, elsewhere. But one thing that what you said now is very interesting, is that there is such a profound connection with, social phenomenology as such and that problem, right? Because the way you just framed it is that if the situation you just described were to happen, it would oblige a necessary separation from being and appearing, because those two things would be separated in a way that our society, for it to reproduce itself, it cannot sustain that level of distinction between these things, where there's something which can remain indifferent, and there are differences that make a difference and that are just separated from that at that level. Like there's one way in which you pose this, you frame the anxiety right now, which is a very particular anxiety about almost recognizing that what is socially effective has that level of decoupling from some substratum that is, you're not supposed to approach social life like that, right? you're supposed to embed it further and to say that there is no difference, that is not making a difference, right? So yeah, that's a really interesting way of also adding a different dimension to it.
And part of what's interesting is talking to older trans people, and they're like, some people, a lot of them don't think this way. A lot of people think like things used to be really good for us. Like having public advocacy for trans people sucks because like people can only hate us when they know that we exist in some capacity. And it's like, I've talked to a lot of older trans people that were like pretty happy and doing all right, you know, before like the 2010s. And they're like, no, like part of what's really bad is the attention. Because it was, you know, in some sense, a group of people that for the most part was really dissolved. But which trans people, right? Like this is also like white trans people of a certain class.
Sure.
So where that line gets drawn, I think is very complicated. And I think part of that is that, you know, they're not imaginable as trans because there's been this movement now where it's like, no, trans people are fucking like college educated urban white liberals with blue hair now. For like conservatives, that's like the scary image. And that is very different than a black sex worker, you know, in Queens or something, which I think like was one operative image of what a trans person is like. And I'm in the States, but like, I also feel, and maybe this is just because I'm hanging out and talking to a lot of activists in Brazil, but I think like, because there's maybe, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, like travesti is kind of like a third gender category in some capacity. And there is like a racialized class dimension that like a lot of activist work is being done by people that are in kind of this position in society that is not as, it's not the kind of scary assimilation that you're going to get, because by people that aren't necessarily angling to assimilate the same way. It's tied to like a broader political critique.
Yeah, I think that there is the issue is framed. I mean, it has a lot of different connotations in Brazil just because of the structure of the country being so different. Not sure how I would. Yeah, I wouldn't say travesti is that well established as a separate third position, but I think that it changes so much across the country. It's very regional. It depends on the decade, and it's really intermingled with racial and class structure. But I mean, just to give an example, something we discussed before here on at the level of race, which I think is a good marker to separate the states and Brazil. And then I wonder if we can make something similar and generalize for other differences. Because, for example, there is something about the way Brazil was built as a society, which is very different from the States. So you can actually scaffold this. Clearly, both are countries where, you know, wealth and value is structuring of society, of course. But in Brazil, the Portuguese came, pretty much killed off indigenous populations, brought from the outside both Portuguese and the largest Black diaspora in the world to build something for the state, meaning the land is initially state organized, and communities are a side product of intermingle between capital and state. So you look at the land as a place to extract wealth from, and you're bringing workers to be both the slave and the slave manager. I don't know how you say this in English, which is the Portuguese didn't want to be here, the Blacks clearly didn't want to be here. So, and they killed off indeed. So you don't have any community first, either as a segregated community that you then build a state to manage that segregation, and then on top of it, you have the state managing the segregation for the sake of value extraction and surplus production, which I think is more like the States, right? Having something like state-sponsored segregatory structure, and then on top of that, commercial development. In Brazil, you have state and commercial development, and then as a kind of excrescence of that, communities form. So you get to have like a higher degree of miscegenation. So, for example, the colorism discussion in the States doesn't translate at all to Brazil. It's totally different. The relation to the territory is very different for people. So you get a very different scaffolding of these kind of modes, right? Like it's very hard to use mode A, community structures, to build political movements, because communities are frail in some sense. They don't have lasting memories. They're not attached to places, even neighborhoods, like the famous Italian neighborhood, the famous, Black neighborhood. It's not like that, generally speaking, because it wasn't getified, because the communities weren't preserved for the sake of the particular way plantations were built in Brazil. So you get a very different society, and that reflects on, how racism expresses itself, and you're not going to control people necessarily by, for example, explicit apartheid structure. It reflects much more directly on the economic. Immediately, the person won't be able to get to the place to share the place. You don't need to put to forbid them to do it, and things like that. So I'm not sure. Just saying, when you get these different social formations, I think this expresses itself differently. And the fact that Brazil had a different social structure, but imported, due to imperialism, a discourse that fit the American structure better, right? You get a mismatch between how we present ourselves and how we actually behave, which is huge. And in that difference, a relation to sexuality and to gender, which is, plastic in different ways, emerged. So you have a culture of, this is not publicly debatable, but privately performable. That is very much part of, at least in some regions of Brazil, very much part of how you negotiate with the in-between of communities, with the state, with representation, and so on, right? I have the impression that that's not the same for the state, even though what you just said about older trans people saying, there wasn't a way of navigating invisibility. It sounds a bit like that, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to sort of think through is I was just in Brazil for a month and a half, and I was mostly in Sao Paulo and Campinas, and I was spending a lot of time with trans people. And what I notice here is that a lot of trans organizing in the United States that's not specifically for Black trans women is being done by white tech bros, right? That have a certain kind of material basis. There's a lot of organization that's done by people that have a certain amount of assimilation. And there's kind of there's complex respectability battles going on. And I was very surprised to end up in trans spaces in Brazil and things that were being sponsored by organizations like SESC. That was just oh, there are these really visible things that are happening by people that are Black sex workers that are trans women from the favela. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be in that context, right? In the state of Sao Paulo, maybe that's its own thing. But I was oh, there are people that have a very different idea of vision of what organizing is, and who's being included and where it's coming from, and the goals are very different. Mm-hmm. I think there's a radicality in the spaces I was in that I very rarely see in trans spaces of the United States, because I think there's a panic that exists in the States, and people are really, really scared. Mm-hmm. But I think there's an imaginary of assimilation and a possibility of assimilation here. That shapes the contours very differently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Because you have white trans people so integrated in the labor force already. So there's a way in which I wonder how much of the panic is how integrated people have become already. Not to say that it's a different kind of violence potentially than I think happens elsewhere. But I don't know so much about Brazil, right?
No, but I think this is very perspicuous about the difference. I think it's a difference that makes sense more generally because I think that the bargain in the States, as far as I understand, some of the depoliticizing bargains that the United States can offer is because at some level there is a deep conviction that if you depoliticize, decollectivize, and individualize, there will be some solution, like in the sense of work, like integration through some level of income, some level of some types of labor, like I just think it's just mildly connected. But for example, I'm not sure if you guys realize, but if you look at any movie, 80% of editors of movies are women, because it is like a small niche of an individual, isolated, safe job you can do on your own, and it just absorbed a part of the workforce that wouldn't be absorbed elsewhere without high risk, of all sorts of things. So there is this kind of horizon, which I think even if it's just a fake horizon, you can still bargain with it, which is at some level, think of the cost of disrupting some social structure by organizing and facing all sorts of risks, which I think that then there is the other issue, which is there are the risks that you are willing to take to organize. And there are also the risks you're obliged to assume, not because you want it, but because the whole political scene will throw in your lap, even though it's not yours to carry. So there's also this kind of dark forest structure of, everyone expecting which movement will take the lead, and then everyone will put their expectations that they will be the vanguard of something, and by consequence also be, the target of the right. So there is this whole kind of bargain and problematic risk on the one hand, but it still offers some horizon of, if you just disband, dismantle, assume certain negotiations with the market, with commodity, with the economy, and so on and so forth, there might be a solution. Whereas that makes no sense for a good part of the Brazilian population, which already knows that horizon either never existed or doesn't exist anymore for them. So they feel managed by the state at a beyond value. Like your value is extracted, but that never means you'll be integrated in any social sense, right? So I think that there is a lot about the American way of life, if you're being a bit vulgar here, that does promise the connection that if labor is included, you are socially included at some degree, because if at such minimal kind of atomic level, everything is already priced. So it does stand to reason that if you manage to price something you do, you'll be, kind of pulled by that current. Whereas in Brazil, you get that distinction much clearer, that to be economically integrated is not to be socially integrated. So I think that the amount of risk people are willing to take to organize a bit more radically, Latin America has a much clearer sense of, a historical weight that you can lean on to organize and feel like that's meaningful, that makes that bargain slightly different compared to the States, which I do feel it's very hard to make that scale like honestly meaningful to organize after a certain threshold, because the risks are so high, the power of the enemy is so huge, that sometimes it feels like a deadlock, like holy shit. It's yeah, it's like so I don't know, it feels very, very sensitive to pick on that that difference, perhaps. Don't generalize it, of course, but it does sound meaningful of something.
Well, we're about the 3-hour mark, so I want to wrap up here. But I do want to just add something on to that really interesting back and forth there, because I think that there's a lot to tease. But as another thing that I want to do research on, and also runs up against every hair of American respectability politics, is the relationship between a large portion of the queer community and trans community, and especially racially intersection there, and sex work and the transformations in that. And particularly, I would say, like the kind of autonomization of sex work that's been happening with things like OnlyFans, and the kind of data exposure that also goes along with that. For example, a lot of the states with the most anti-trans laws also have some of the highest amounts of trans porn consumption. So I think that there's a lot of ways in which this visibility dialectic and the labor of reproducing fantasy that is so much of what sex work is. You know, during the Trump administration, as there was beginning to be a ramp up against trans and queer folks, but it wasn't working too well, he also passed the Sesta Fosta Acts, which greatly punished companies for having websites that had anything, you know, it's always like trafficking children, but it's always actually targeting consensual sex workers. And there's a danger in overly like identifying trans folks with sex work. I recognize that, but there's also just a statistical huge overlap, especially again at those places where race comes in. And so I think that there's a lot that's transformed in that world as a result of the internet and the like the visibility of fantasy that comes with the mass distribution of porn, and the kind of like, if you can imagine it, there's a porn of it slogan means that if there's a lot of trans porn, there's a lot of people fantasizing about that. And I think that there is something that's at play there as well, that touches on everything from questions of social reproduction and control over bodies to like the ongoing violent repetition of, you know, a trans woman murdered because of a man discovering that she's trans. And so like there's a lot of these things that are going on that I think need to be further researched, and that Preciado's work in particular kind of helps to start asking these questions. But one of the key places that I'm super interested in what it means, especially throughout the Americas, because there's all kinds of weird and cool organizing, is sex worker organizing, the intersections there along race, gender, and queerness. And what that means with exactly what a lot of what Ariel is talking about in terms of respectability politics. I mean, there's very few groups of workers that get shit on more than sex workers. And I think that there's certain overlaps there. So, but yeah, so that's actually just adding on. I don't really like what you both said is going to leave me thinking. And in general, I just really appreciate all the feedback here. It's left me with a lot more to work with. This is just very much the beginning. Feel free if anyone has other stuff to reach out to me and message me. I'm happy to continue this. If you have concrete things that are happening that you think I'd be interested in touching or tapping into or touching base with, let me know about that. But yeah, this was great. So I want to thank everyone for their feedback and participation. And
That was so cool.
A not easy topic. Like this is heavy shit. So that's
No,
awesome.
really hard. Hopefully, Vitor will also continue with his presentation.
What was
So
that?
I think Vitor is also planning a presentation that is in dialogue with yours. So
oh, nice.
Hopefully we can like pick up and not let the, continue with the debate. Guys, sleep well. See you,
All right.
Monica.
Take care,
See you,
y'all.
Ariel. See you, John.